God is never done creating. Every time we ask for help, He creates and recreates. God has 1,000 ways to answer our every need. God never runs out of ideas. The Bible tells of a time when God's people were strangers in a strange land. But the pyramids and gods of Egypt are a symbol today of our world. After all, this place is not our home. And like Israel's slavery of old, we have the challenge of our own bondage, captivity to the idols of our day, or most insidious of modern snares, the relentless living to work, to achieve, to accumulate. And even we are not immune to Moses' temptation to provide our own solutions to our God-sized problems. But God is always present. And when we finally realize that when we are standing in the midst of our greatest problems, we are also standing on holy ground, then, only then, may we begin to lean on the Almighty to be our help and our deliverance. From victory unto victory, God is our ever-present help in times of trouble. And as God promised to raise up a prophet among men like his servant Moses, so Jesus is our deliverer today from the severe bondage of sin. Consider the irony. Moses was the adopted son of Pharaoh. With that title came all the wealth and privilege a man in his day could have hoped for. But next to Pharaoh himself, there is no comparison. All the bluster and might of the grand leader of Egypt was no match for a man who would see God face to face. The humble servant Moses stands as a giant among men, for it is better to live in obscurity with God's blessing than to die a king forsaken by God. Equally ironic is that the same waters that seemed to spell doom for the Israelites served instead as their very means of deliverance. Isn't that just like God? What Pharaoh thought was the means to corner his enemy turned out, in fact, to be the watery grave that would end his own persecution of God's people. So the choice is ours. What and who we live for is actually what determines our true state of freedom. There is no question that the Christian walk is one of continual challenge. When Israel finally entered the Promised Land, they had to learn the lesson that God's continued deliverance requires our continued trust. And it remains true today that each generation, even the class of 2014, must experience God personally for themselves. There on the hillside before them, after such great deliverances already, stood the mighty city of Jericho, a very real challenge to their still fledgling faith. Don't underestimate what it took not to just turn and run. Indeed, the courage to stand remains God's greatest gift to us, because it is not a matter of if, but when we will face our greatest fears. But though the temptation is strong to turn back or to be content with victories past, we will never learn how great our God is until we march head on into our own impossibilities. God's instructions were rather specific. Follow the ark, the covenant chest, the mercy seat, the symbol of God's holy presence. Friends, if we want God to fight our battles, we need to let him go first, which is just another way of saying that if we want God to lead, we must be trusting followers. And maybe you missed the lesson of the final overthrow of Jericho. Don't ever forget that praise to God remains the key to unleashing his power amidst our darkest moments. Remembering God's gift in the past empowers us to face our future, even today. One final story casts its instructive shadow over us in the 21st century world we call home. It is a scene that would be repeated again and again for ancient Israel. God's people camped across a valley from those enemies determined to impede their progress. The Philistines were an ever-present challenge to God's conquest of their new home. In our highly individualistic society, we nevertheless face the relentless pressure to conform to the world's faithless pattern. In young David's case, the so-called expert advice of Saul was lavished upon the young man of faith in the form of a suit of armor that God wasn't giving and David was not needing. It was faith that would lead a shepherd boy to go looking for a few small stones. But that kind of faith isn't born overnight. And neither is the trust in God that would lead his humble servant to take up a simple means at hand to face an intimidating giant. But that's precisely the lesson of this story. So, what are your sling and stones? What simple means, what simple talents in your mind is God asking you to put to his use right now? Are you still waiting for a king's armor and some expert knowledge? A tiny faith in a big God is far superior to a great but foolish reliance on worldly means and wisdom. But don't worry. We won't finish our little story in shadows without the photo finish. The truth is, God has his way that day because God first had David. And, by the way, take a page from Goliath's notebook and don't let self-confidence give you a big head, or you just might lose it.